Alright, so this is your government final exam. As always, if you need some more time, just go back to that question and complete it. You need to complete all of part 1 before moving on to part 2. But you can go back to questions in part 1 while you're still in that section. Okay? So, number 1 says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This quotation is evidence that some of the basic ideas of the Declaration of Independence were A. Limitations of the principles underlying most European governments of the 1700s. B. Adaptations of the laws from Spanish colonial governments in North America. C. Adoptions of rules by the Holy Roman Empire. Or D. Reflections of the philosophies of the European Enlightenment. Okay, so looking at this quote, think about that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Who originally said this? What do we know about them and the time period in which they lived? Okay, clearly they had an effect on the Declaration of Independence and its writing. So what do we know about them? Number 2, in the United States, the use of implied powers, the amending process, and Supreme Court interpretations has resulted in what? A. A general loss of individual rights. B. A strengthening of the principle of separation of powers. C. The Constitution being adapted to fit changing times. D. The limiting of presidential power in domestic affairs. So you want to think about these, the idea of implied powers, the amendment process, Supreme Court rulings. Why do we use amendments? How do we use Supreme Court decisions? How do they change the law of the land? Why are they necessary? Okay, think about that when doing this question. Number 3, which quotation from the United States Constitution provides for a federal system of government, or federalism? So remember, federalism is the division of power between the what and the what. We went over this in our first paper, right? So think about what you know about federalism and then decide which one of these quotes shows federalism. A. He shall have power with the advice and consent of the Senate and shall appoint. B. Every bill shall, before it becomes a law, be presented to the President of the U.S. C. The powers not delegated or given to the United States are reserved or given to the states. D. Full faith and credit should be given to each state in the public acts record and judicial proceedings of every other state. Number 4, the system of checks and balances is best illustrated by the power of what? So where do we best see checks and balances show up in these choices? A. The President to veto a bill passed by Congress. B. Congress to censure one of its members or disapprove of formally one of its members of Congress. C. A governor sending the National Guard to stop a riot. Or D. State and federal governments to levy and collect taxes. So where do you see one branch of government checking on another branch? Number 5, the flexibility of the original U.S. Constitution is due mainly to what? So how is it able to be flexible? What is it that makes the Constitution flexible? A. Its provision for the amendment process and judicial interpretation. B. Its guarantees of freedom and justice for all people. C. The ability to create new branches of government as needed. Or D. The willingness of the states to accept federal control. Well, how does the Constitution end up being flexible? What makes it flexible? Number 6, the foundations of American government are best traced to what? Where do we get the roots of democracy? Where did that come from? A, 11th century Chinese dynasties. B, the Middle Ages of Europe. C, the Byzantine Empire and Constantine. Or D, ancient Rome and Athens, Greece. Number 7, the Supreme Court justices are given their position by what? How does one become a Supreme Court justice? Is it through A, popular elections, B, completing a specialized program, C, presidential appointment and congressional confirmation, or D, United Nations selection committees? How does one end up being a Supreme Court justice? Number 8 just asks you to identify the current makeup of the Supreme Court. I'll narrow this down to 2 for you. It's either B or C. So I need you to think about which way does it lean currently, the Supreme Court. Okay, so B is 5 liberals and 4 conservatives, and C is 3 liberals and 6 conservatives. Number 9, states that are considered the least predictable in their electoral college or electoral voting patterns are referred to as what? So ones that you can't really predict how they're going to vote. Is this A, the Solid South, B, the Blue Wall, C, the caucus states, or D, the swing states? Can't really figure out which way they're going to vote. Might vote either way. Number 10, to reduce the possibility of political sabotaging, which type of nomination is held? A, open primary, B, referendum, C, closed primary, or D, blanket runoff. Okay, which one of these do you not know who's being voted for, so it helps to keep it fair? Number 11, one position within political parties has the role of making sure that people in the party vote the way the majority and leadership of the party is asking them to do. 2, this position is known as what? So which person is going to help keep that party in line? A, the Senate Majority Leader, B, the party whip, C, the parliamentary leader, or D, the bully pulpit? Number 12, Fox News has been most closely associated with to which viewers? A, left-wing liberals, B, centrists, C, socialists, D, right-wing conservatives. Which people are going to be more likely to watch Fox News? Number 13, in the 2008 and 2012 elections, minorities were most likely to vote for what party? So minorities, we're thinking of Black, Hispanic, Asian populations. Which one are they most likely to vote for? A, Republican, B, Libertarian, C, Green, D, Democratic. Number 14 asks, the Cold War, Vietnam conflict, and Watergate scandal are mostly connected to what? A, an increased partnership in the U.S. An increased partisanship in the U.S., so dividing among party lines. B, a decline in trust of the government. C, a sharp rise in budget spending. D, the end of the New Deal era programs. Okay, so for this one, think specifically about like the Watergate scandal where Nixon, a Republican, he was set to be impeached and convicted. How might the press speaking poorly about him and the way that that was covered and the way that the Vietnam War was covered, how might that affect how we feel about the government? Number 15. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled in Roe v. Wade that a woman's right to privacy in her health decisions would be protected. By keeping this decision today, the Supreme Court will be practicing what? Think about B or C. So we talked about this. Are the judges being activists or showing restraint with this decision? So is it judicial activism, B, or judicial restraint, C? Number 16. In a Senate vote on Bill S-2231, sponsored by a Georgia senator, the representative from Missouri promised to vote in favor of the legislation in return for Georgia's promise to support Bill S-3232. This activity is best described as what? So this is the I do something for you, you have to do something for me. Is that A, the spoils system, B, bipartisan politics, C, quid pro quo, D, pork barrel spending? Number 17, which of the following people is not a New York State political official? Is that going to be A, Russell Brandeis, B, Kirsten Gillibrand, C, Chuck Schumer, D, Kerry Warner? 3 of these are New York State political officials. Which one is not? Use the process of elimination here. Number 18. Healthcare is a universal human right is an idea most closely related to who? A, Republicans, B, Libertarians, C, the Tea Party Patriots, or D, the Green Party? Who's going to be pushing for universal health care, think that it's a human right and we need to take care of it? Which party? Number 19. In New York State, Republican voters often feel that their votes don't matter in presidential elections because of what? So New York is almost always going to turn, or it always is going to turn blue in presidential races because of what? A, voter fraud, B, the electoral system, electoral college system, C, upstate voting laws, or D, 21st century voting laws? Number 20. It says grandfather clauses, voting ID laws, and literacy tests are examples of what? So I will rule this down to A or C. Is this going to be disenfranchisement tactics or protection of voters? Okay, so think about why they were created. Why were grandfather clauses, voting ID laws, literacy tests created? Number 21 says, we also assess Putin and the Russian governments aspired to help President-elect Trump's election chances, when possible, by discrediting Secretary Clinton and publicly contrasting her unfavorably to him. All 3 agencies agree with this judgment. Okay? So it says, the statement from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence suggests which group was created in order to interfere with the U.S. election in 2016. So we need the name of the group. Is it A, Perestroika, B, Glavset and the IRA, C, Glasnost, or D, Karova? Number 22 asks about this little image that's up here, and it says, according to the CDC, people with dirt on the Clintons have an 843% greater risk of suicide. So they're essentially implying that if you know something about the Clintons, then you might be in danger of being killed and them making it out to look like a suicide. So it says number 22, headlines similar to the ones shown above are most associated with which type of media? A, mainstream media, B, satire, C, Fox News, or D, tabloids. We've talked about this a lot. Number 23, an independent expenditure group that can spend money in any way it wants to and also has no donation limit is better known as what? So I'll put this down to B or D. Is that going to be a lobby group or a super PAC? So they can spend money any way they want and they have no donation limit. Number 24. New York State has 29 total electoral college votes in 2016. If candidate A wins 55% of the popular vote and candidate B wins 40% of the popular vote, how many electoral votes will candidate A win? So think about how electors work. Do they split the vote? What happens with them? So A will win 15 electors, B will win 14. A will win 20 and B will win 9. C, A's portion depends on third-party votes. Or D, A will win all 29 votes. How does our electoral college system work? Number 25. Which action resulted in the creation of super PACs, groups that can provide unlimited spending for political candidates? Is that A, the Tillman Act of 1907, B, Gore v. Bush, C, Gonzales v. Oregon, or D, Citizens United versus FEC? Number 26, the 55 to 45 vote to confirm Neil Gorsuch and the 50 to 48 vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court were both considered short of the 60 required votes. But each was completed by what? So think, they didn't have the 60 votes that they needed, but what did they get? Is it A, a constitutional amendment, B, the nuclear option of a simple majority, C, a presidential override, or D, a revote that ended in or enabled 61 yay votes? Number 27. What group is most likely to participate in both online and offline political activity? So all groups, except for B in this case, and I'll read through them in a second, participate online, but one group is more likely to participate in political activity in real life, offline. So what group is that? A, millennials of all incomes and gender, B, elderly low-income males with 2-year degrees, C, middle-aged, educated, economically stable, or D, middle-aged, non-college educated, poor. Who's going to get involved in politics both online and offline? Number 28, the National Rifle Association, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, Veterans of Foreign Wars, and National Educator Association are all acronyms for what? Think about your Powtoon or Google Slides assignment. What are these groups called? A, PACs, B, super PACs, C, special interest groups, or D, political parties? Number 29. Which of the following is most likely to be fighting for better wages and work hours? So who is going to be dealing with workers' rights? A, business groups, B, agricultural groups, C, professional associations, or D, labor groups. Number 30. Which of the amendments most successfully increased enfranchisement? So which one increased people's rights, particularly minorities and women? It's going to be is that A, the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 19th, B, the 2nd, 7th, and 16th, C, the 1st, 6th, and 22nd, or D, the 11th and 12th. Think about the ones that you know. Number 31. Which of these following statements is not true? A, Asian Americans are the least likely demographic to vote. They don't vote a lot. B, a higher percentage of the African American population votes more than the percentage of the Hispanic population. C, fewer than 75% of all Americans vote. Or D, minorities equally support all parties. So you want to do this process of elimination. Which ones are true? Cross those out. What's left? Number 32. What's the most common reason polls are off by usually up to 5% when results are analyzed? A, they only survey people in cities. B, college-educated individuals participate more and they sway the results. C, they're completely made up to begin with. Or D, most polls ask less than 100 people about their opinions. Why are these polls sometimes a little bit off? Number 33. As people become more educated through high school, college, and graduate school, they're more likely to increase their preference for which type of media to absorb the news. What type of media are they going to look for? Is that A, internet articles, B, radio broadcasts, C, printed books and academic journals, or D, television programs? Number 34. What is the main motivation for people who write and publish fake news stories? Why do they do it? A, entertainment. B, political influence. C, money from ad revenues. D, starting social revolutions. Number 35. Before votes are certified in a state, what must be completed? So we want to think about which one's the most fair. If you look at something and you say, this is not fair, this doesn't make any sense, rule it out. So in order for the votes to be certified in a state, A, the party that holds power in the state legislature must approve them. B, the president must review the results. C, the Supreme Court will determine the authenticity of the cast ballots. Or D, bipartisan teams will complete a canvassing of vote totals and verification processes. Number 36. The special power of the Supreme Court was established in this landmark case. We're talking about judicial review here. Where was that established? A, Brown versus the Board of Education. B, Roe v. Wade. C, McCulloch versus Maryland. D, Marbury versus Madison. Number 37. This age group has historically been the least likely to vote. Which group's not going to the polls as much? 18 to 24-year-olds, 25 to 44-year-olds, 45 to 65-year-olds, or 66 up. Number 38. Which statement best describes the scenarios of voter fraud studied by Loyola and Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law? So what do we know about voter fraud? What do we actually know, not by what some random media site is telling you? A. Laws allow more illegal citizens to create fake IDs and vote. B. It's statistically a non-issue because it happens so infrequently. C. Every year, hundreds of thousands of dead people are registered to vote. D. Only Democrats have been proven to have committed voter fraud. Number 39. Which of the following is not a presidential power or action? So, what is something that what is something that the president cannot do? Do not be fooled by this one. A. Veto a bill. B. Appoint a Supreme Court justice. C. Declare a war. Or D. Give the State of the Union address. What is one thing that a president cannot do? Number 40, something we've talked about a bunch of times. It just says, what's the topic of this cartoon? What do we talk about when we talked about these funny shaped districts? Is that A, campaign finance reform, B, dark delegates, C, the Electoral College, or D, gerrymandering? So once you complete this, you're done with this entire section. If you have any questions that you did not answer or you want to change the answer to in this section, you need to do that now, okay, before you move on. So you can always go back in the video, scroll around to find the question that you want, and look at that again. In a moment, I'm going to move on to the second part, so you can pause it as needed. So now we have the short response questions. You want to make sure you're as thorough as possible. You can throw in some outside information that you have, as long as it's credible. Okay, so for this first one, it says discuss at least 4 major differences the two opposing parties hold on wedge issues found throughout the political landscape of the U.S. today. So I set up just like a little thing that has examples of wedge issues that you can take a peek at. So you're going to need to pick 4 of these. So I have like gay marriage and LGBT rights, abortion, immigration, gun control, climate change, the minimum wage, taxation. Those are all examples of wedge issues. You need to pick 4 of them. And then you can set it up like this. You can just say, okay, this is the wedge issue. So let's just say abortion. Republicans believe this. Democrats believe this. You need to do that with 4 of them. So pause this to take the time to do that. Number 2, in the modern era, fake news has become a ubiquitous term. Discuss the origins of fake news, the concerns over selective perception confirmation bias, and 2 reasons that you might question the reliability of a source. So these are some things you have to think about here. Why did people start creating fake news? Why do people still fall for fake news? What kinds of people are falling for it? You know, what might they lack? What might they have experienced in their life? Remember, we have selective perception And confirmation bias. So selective perception is when you only look for what you want to see in a news story, you ignore the other side. You only read the parts that go along with what you already believed. Confirmation bias is when you find something that agrees with your point of view, so then you just decide that that article is true without fact-checking because it confirms your ideas. You might be wrong, but that confirmation bias is certainly going to play here. So you got to answer that question, why do people start creating fake news? Why do people still fall for fake news? Talk a little bit about selective perception and confirmation bias and how that can be dangerous. And then what are 2 things you might see on a website or an article that might make you think it's not a reliable source? Okay, so I'm thinking back to that Hillary Clinton one that they had above. I know that's not a reliable source, but what do I have to do to check to see if it is? Number 3, over the past decade, allegations of voter suppression have existed throughout the U.S. In the space below, discuss 3 tactics people feel are being employed to make it more difficult to vote and how these attempts function. So what are some ways that people have tried to make voting difficult for certain people? What specific things do some people or groups do to make voting harder? How does it make it harder? Think about who these people are that is being made more difficult for. What are they socioeconomically? What are they racially? Typically. Obviously not true in all cases. And then number 4 of your short answers just asks, in the book What You Should Know About Politics by Jessamyn Conrad, 13 major topics were discussed. Which of the chapters did you feel to be the most important to government class? And what are some things that you learned? So you're essentially just going to pick one of the chapters of What You Should Know About Politics. You're going to tell me a little bit about what you learned in that chapter, and then give me a little bit of information about how that affects how our government works. So pick one and explain it. So we've got the military healthcare crisis, the amount of money we put into the military, effects of the Vietnam War and Iraq wars on enlistment. Those are 3 things you might want to touch on. With energy, where does most oil in the U.S. come from? What are some issues we have with nuclear power, coal power, etc.? Think about the climate, think about the possibility for disaster. Why do we have issues with them? The next 2 might be a little more interesting for you. So we have civil liberties. So how do a lot of protests get broken up recently? What other civil liberty issues are popular with voters, like gun rights and government surveillance, things like that? Okay, so what do we know about civil liberties and how does that affect the government? And then we have culture wars. So what are some things that we can't seem to agree on as a country? Abortion, gun rights, LGBT rights, etc. How does this affect the way we communicate each other? How does this affect the way the people in our government communicate with each other when these wedge issues exist? And the last one is education. What are some of the problems that we have with how we currently fund schools, so through property taxes? How has standardized education or standardized testing affected schools? And what happens with many new schools in low-income areas? So you're just picking one of these chapters. You're going to say, hey, I found the chapter about the military the most important to government class. I learned blah, 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 blah. This is important to government because, tell me. Alright, if you need to, you can scroll back into this section to get something reread to you or to look at the notes. But that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, shoot me an email.